Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're all doing very well. And we are playing some more Golgari with the November updated list, and been loving it. The changes have been minor, but they've felt strong on the whole. Now, we have won the dice roll, we are on the play, and our hand is pretty great, right? For a blind game one, we have, I always say the ideal balance of spells to lands is 4 spells, 3 lands. Now, here we have 4/3, but when one of your lands doubles as a threat, then that balance becomes more like 3.5 to 3.5 in practice. So I like that a lot. Our land base is pretty painless, and we have access to both colors and in abundance. We have 2 forms of interaction, and we have our best threat in a blind game. If we can only have one threat to be proactive with in a blind game, it's going to be the Tarmogoyf. Thoughtseize is going to be good no matter what they're doing, and Fatal Push may be about the best form of interaction we could have, or it might be totally dead, but we're definitely pretty happy to see it not knowing what we're up against. So I really cannot complain about this hand. Our opponent will take a mulligan to 6, and then they will be satisfied with their 6. So let's lead off with the Thoughtseize, of course, see what they are up to. And we are against Storm. This is a matchup I have played against a fair amount. It's fairly common on MTGO, and I have struggled to find an acceptable replay for it. As you know, I use the replay function, and a couple things seem to kind of short-circuit that function, and one of them is Amulet Titan, whether it's the Amulet of Vigor itself and all the untaps that kind of mess things up or what. And another one seems to be Storm. So sometimes when the Storm player is actually storming off, the replay just shows the game ending or bizarre things happening that didn't happen. So I finally came across a Storm matchup that actually seems to show what happened. So that's step 1. Now, Gift Storm is, of course, a combo deck. It's going to try to cast as many spells as possible in one turn and then finish us off with a grape shot, at least game 1. Game 2, they'll probably sideboard into some alternative payoffs for that, but basically they're trying to chain a bunch of spells together and maybe do a little bit of interacting along the way, but mostly they're linear, especially game 1. So we have a couple pairs of Serum Visions, which is a really nice cantrip for digging and setting up the following turns. We have Monomorphos, which draws a card and adds 2 mana. It costs 2 mana, so this can fix their mana a little bit, but mostly it's a way to just keep digging and keep ramping up the storm count. Substantiate is a flexible piece of interaction, and all of this stuff, Monomorphos on Substantiate, gets better with one of their mana bears on board, and of course they don't have any of those in hand. Finally, they have Past in Flames, which they may struggle to kill us without utilizing this card game 1. They, especially if they're trying to kill us all in one shot instead of a few different value grape shot hits, this card will probably be involved on some level. Now, we don't want to take this quite yet for a couple of reasons. Number 1, they are very far away from casting it. Number 2, it has flashback. So with our deck specifically, there will be windows you want to take this without having a plan to get it out of the yard, but we really want to see Scavenging Ooze, and we want to get this in the yard on our own terms with a way to remove it immediately. That's the safest way to deal with this card. So if we're not taking Past in Flames, what do we take? Well, Reed Duke has a rule against blue-based control decks, where if you're not sure, you can take away the Snapcaster Mage. Like, if it's a toss-up or if you just don't really know, it's never really wrong to take the Snapcaster because it just represents a 2-for-1 and can probably buy back whatever else you would have taken. I consider Monomorphos to have a similar type of role as far as being a high-priority discard target. Like, if you're not sure against a Storm deck, you cannot really go wrong taking away the Monomorphos. Because it just cantrips, it's just kind of a free spell. It obviously fuels a lot of what else they're up to. So taking Monomorphos when in doubt is never bad. Now, that said, I don't really care about Unsubstantiate. It's kind of like a remand that doesn't draw them a card or an unsummon. Sure, we can beat that. So it's either Monomorphos or one of the Serum Visions. Now, I don't usually like taking Serum Visions for obvious reasons. It's, it can draw them whatever, and the Scry is definitely good, but especially when they have two copies, so they're redundant. But the big reason I didn't is because they kept a one-lander and they scryed to the bottom. So just for the interest of preventing them from hitting their land drops for as long as possible, I took a Serum Visions here. But I think the take there could also have been Monomorphos. It's, if they had scryed to the top, then maybe we'd be taking the Monomorphos. Or, Serum Visions is still a fine take in general because they're on a one-lander, right? That said, they do get to go lead off on their other one, which might do enough to dig them into some more lands. We will have to see. We draw another Tarmogoyf. That is pretty good. That's pretty good. So, definitely want to interact more here than just one Thoughtseize. But we do have an answer to one of their Mana Bears if they find them. That's really good, especially because we're on the play, so we can take a window to resolve our Goyf, and then following turns we can continue to do things while potentially holding up Fatal Push. So, while we do want to interact more, we also really, truly need to clock them. This deck is a lot like Tron in that sense. Like, you're not going to win a straight-up race the vast majority of the time. Like, you need to disrupt them, but you also need to follow up the disruption with as fast of a clock as you can assemble. And with a second Tarmogoyf in hand, Treetop Village also waiting in the wings, we're going some way toward assembling that. Now, I did go Infection Shock here. It's not that our life total doesn't matter, but usually if they can storm off, they're not going to be able to just kill us by the skin of their teeth, right? Usually they're going to kind of overkill us, especially, again, game one, with a one-shot grape shot with Past in Flames involved. Being at 17 versus 15 is not usually the difference there. Now, Lightning Bolt is in their 75 almost certainly. It is probably just a sideboard card, but you never know. So I played around a Lightning Bolt by getting a land in the bin right now. Again, probably not anything to worry about, but we have to just be careful of these things. So they did find a second Spire Bluff Canal. That's quite good for them. They need to definitely hit these land drops. We find Inquisition, which is quite good for us. So we are going to lead off on the Inquisition, and we see the two cards we knew about, plus a third Canal, so they're digging really well for those lands. The Painless Duel is perfectly ideal for them here. And Past in Flames, plus a Gifts Ungiven. Of course, we knew about the Past in Flames as well, but the Gifts, these are kind of the two cards that usually work in tandem. Like, if they resolve a Gifts, and if they have access to Past in Flames, they are probably going to get you unless you're about to win, or unless you have heavy disruption to follow it up. So Gifts Ungiven is a good one, and we're pretty sad that we cannot take this because this is Inquisition and not a Thoughtseize. So there I think we take the Monomorphos again. We're not too worried about that Unsubstantiate. It might set back our clock by 3 points of damage, but I still think taking Monomorphos is way better than, taking their Healing Solve, which is basically what that is at the moment. So here comes their third land, and they will pass. So as far as we know, they can't do anything this turn except Unsubstantiate. And they still don't have a Mana Bear. Now, we have an answer to that if they find it, like I said, but, they still often will really need one to go off in a timely fashion. And our clock is not bad. It would be really nice to have gotten these Goyfs to a 4-5 by getting a creature in the bin somehow. But a pair of 3/4 Tarmogoyfs is not bad. Now, Tireless Tracker is not the best draw here. It's a little slow for the matchup, and, right now it doesn't increase our clock by that much. Unless we are able to fire up Treetop Village next turn, then we're actually presenting lethal. So just seeing this as a 3-2 beater without planning to ever crack the clue, this could get us there. We will have to see, but let's see what the opponent draws here. Okay, the fact that they're tapping right away is not bad for us. Now, they play a Goblin Electromancer, so we're a little punished for going shields down, but they, of course, just top deck that, right? Like, it was definitely correct to play out the tracker, play out the Treetop Village, and if they top deck a Mana Bear, that's not great for us, but they definitely just did. Now, that said, they don't have a 4th land, and that would have been potentially way worse for us if they had a 4th land. That means they still have 1 unknown in hand, but right now, all they can really represent that we know of is Unsubstantiate. And of course, these Mana Bears are reducing casting cost of things by 1, so Unsubstantiate is live. So, Thoughtseize is a pretty good draw, though. So we get to open up on the Thoughtseize here. Or, excuse me. That's right. Okay, so this is what I did. I opened up on the Fatal Push, because this is going to force them to, if they have anything besides the Unsubstantiate, they have to do it now. This means we are giving ourselves the option to either fire up Treetop Village or follow up with a Thoughtseize, depending on what they do here. We're forcing them to take action now. And this turned out to be the play, right? Because I think they just didn't read our Treetop Village, because they make a pretty savvy play here in some situations, right? They're going to bounce their card back to their hand. These Mana Bears are very crucial for them to go off, especially when they're stuck on 3 land. So realistically, like, let's say they have a Ritual in hand, next turn they draw a land, they can go replay this thing, Ritual, and potentially go off from there, or at least go some way toward going off. But here, they don't think they're facing lethal, it seems, so they go ahead and bounce this, blanking my Fatal Push. But again, I don't think they read our Treetop Village too closely, because we fire it up, and now we just have lethal. So, a bit of a misread from our opponent. I just don't think they paid attention to what was back here, between our Swamp and our Overgrown Tomb. That said, if they had just bounced one of our things, they're in a pretty bad position, right? Because we push their Mana Bear, we get in, and, maybe we would have only gotten in for 6, because they bounce, let's say, a Tarmogoyf, we get in for 6. We could fire up the Treetop Village and make it 9, but I think we would rather Thoughtseize at that point. But either way, they would need to have probably a 4th land off the top. If they had a Ritual, we could take it with Thoughtseize. I don't think they get to go off without that Mana Bear around. So either way, pretty sure we had that one wrapped up, but our opponent just did kind of give us lethal there by bouncing their own thing instead of bouncing one of ours. So this was a game where we had, none of what we did looked particularly impressive, right? Like I said, our Goyfs were just a tad too small from where we usually want them to be. This can realistically be a 4 or 5 pretty easily here, and that is just a lot better for the clock. Tireless Tracker is a slow card, it's a grindy card. We always knew we weren't realistically going to crack this clue, so it's just kind of a 3-2 for 3. That said, we drew, and we didn't have any spectacular plays, right? Like, we didn't Fatal Push their thing on curve. Like, they didn't turn 2 play it and we pushed it immediately. That always feels really good. And we didn't have Liliana the Veil running them out of the game. We didn't have a spicy 2-for-2 with Collective Brutality. We just did some really simple things. We cast a Thoughtseize, we cast an Inquisition, and we beat down with some 3-power things. We have 4 3-power creatures getting in for lethal. So none of what we did was spectacular. We just played some average-sized Tarmogoyfs, and we fired off a lot of 1-for-1s. And you know what? Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that type of, middling interaction is just good enough to get them. Now, they did have some really nice combo pieces in hand, but they struggled on mana. They missed their 4th land drop. They didn't find a mana bear until, a little bit later than would have been ideal for them. Now, granted, of course, we had the answer, but still. So they stumbled a little bit. And if we have the consistency of interaction and, the respectable enough threats, even when they're not at their best, that a little bit of a stumble can be punished pretty decisively by us. That's what we saw here. So how do we kit out against Storm? Well, let's go to the sideboard and take a look. Alright everybody, we are here figuring out how we want to sideboard against Storm. And we want access to a few different things, and we have all of them in abundance in the sideboard, but we don't want to bring everything that we possibly could bring in, and I will explain why. So first, let's break down what the categories are that we're interested in. We are interested in hand disruption, so we're going to bring in, or at least consider bringing in, these 2 cards. We are interested in graveyard hate, so we are going to bring in Nile Spellbomb. We can include Surgical Extraction here, which is kind of graveyard hate that doubles as combo hate. This is, of course, valid against both kind of aspects of their deck. We also want to bring in mass token removal, and for that reason, we're interested in Charm, Pulse, and Explosives. So before we break down why we want these 3 categories and which of those we can actually bring in and which ones we kind of want to leave out, let's see if there's anything else we're interested in. Kalidas, no. Board wipes, no. Again, we want things that can kill tokens. I think Languish is probably a little bit too deep, especially because we might not be bringing in all of these anyway. Fulminator Mage is interesting, right? Because we do kind of want to keep them off of lands, and off of mana, I should say, not off of lands. And that might be why we don't want him, because their mana bears are going to give them a lot of artificial mana. They have rituals that they can play out of the hand and flashback out of the graveyard potentially. So does Fulminator Mage do enough? I'm not sure. Choke is in the same boat. Obviously they're a blue-red deck, and we can realistically shut down at least some of their mana production some of the time. But we saw there they had 3 dual lands in play, and none of them were islands. So these cards are actually viable. They're actually viable in the matchup, but I don't think we're going to want them either, because we already have these 9 cards we're considering, and we frankly don't have enough in the main deck that's bad, in my opinion. So let's take a look at these categories of things we definitely have some interest in. So hand disruption is pretty obvious. We saw there that a couple simple Inquisitions and Thoughtseizes just really broke the back of the Storm opponent and let us just kill them with some 3-power creatures just turning sideways in a relatively quick fashion. If we didn't have that hand disruption, that would not have gone well for us. So Collective Brutality, Duress, they're both quite good. They're both good in their own ways. So Brutality can kill Goblin Electromancer, but not their other mana bear, which is Baral, Chief of Compliance. That said, the life drain is somewhat relevant for speeding up our clock in certain situations, but mainly this is in to take away instants or sorceries, and that is mostly what we want to be hitting out of the Storm deck anyway. We want to hit, we want to be able to hit their Storm spells, be it Great Shot or Empty the Warrens if the situation calls for it. We definitely want to take Gifts Ungiven. Sometimes we'll want to take Past in Flames, usually only if we have a way to deal with it right away. Taking Monomorphose, taking even a cantrip like we did game 1, that is all good. And Duress is also quite good for the same reasons here. So definitely want access to both of these. I think those 2 for sure come in. Now here is where we want to hedge a little bit more with these 2 categories. We have Grave Hate and we have answers to a wide board. Now in game 1, the stock plan for Storm, although it is possible for them to play alternative win conditions in the main deck, of course, Their stock win condition is Grape Shot. They're going to storm off, they're going to cast a bunch of spells, get a really high storm count, they're going to Grape Shot us for lethal, and often assembling a high enough storm count for lethal means utilizing Past in Flames to flash back a bunch of cards, including flashing back the Grape Shot. So, like, they'll Grape Shot you for 9, and then they'll Grape Shot you for 10, and you're dead. That is the plan A for the Storm deck. And obviously, Nile Spellbomb is really good against that, because it can clear out a Past in Flames. Like, we can take a Past in Flames with a discard and then Spellbomb it away before they, at some point, not necessarily right away, before they have the mana available to cast it. We can also Spellbomb it in response... We can fire off Spellbomb, activate it in response to a Past in Flames that they cast from hand, clearing out their graveyard and making the Past in Flames worthless. We can also just in certain windows, if their graveyard is big enough and we feel we need the draw, we can just clear out their graveyard, making their future Past in Flames a lot worse. Surgical Extraction is nice for the same reason. It can compete over their value out of the graveyard. This can also take, all of their win conditions out of the deck. It can take out all of the Grape Shots. But again, the problem with these cards is that they are not as dependent on the graveyard post side, because they know things like this are going to come in. Extraction, indeed, might be better at taking away a card like Gifts Ungiven, if we have the opportunity to do so, than taking away Grape Shot. Now, the primary plan B for a Storm deck is to side in some number of the card Empty the Warrens, which is another Storm card that's going to make a pair of 1/1 Goblin tokens for every spell. How Storm works. So they're going to just make a massive amount of 1/1 Goblins, and our deck, with a lot of threats that lack evasion, might struggle to deal with even a moderately sized Empty the Warrens. Like, if they on turn 3 make 8 Goblins, well, that can actually be really tough to beat. Our planes, our Liliana the Veils are great against them, but those can pressure Lily off the field and indeed can start clocking us, and at the very least gum up our board for a really long time, let them rebuild and storm off again. So that's why we need access to some number of cards like Engineered Explosives, Maelstrom Pulse, and Golgari Charm to kill their goblins. So I don't think we can afford to bring in all 9 of these sideboard cards. And that would mean we're not even considering any of the ways to attack their mana base. So what do? Well, here's my opinion. I rate Surgical Extraction a little bit more highly than Nile Spellbomb because, like I said, arguably the best take for this is a card that's not as dependent on the graveyard Gifts Ungiven. Like, they can still build really effective gifts piles even if we have a Spellbomb around. So Extraction is pretty much good. If they totally side out anything graveyard dependent, it's still good. And it's good against their stock plan A, and it's good if they kind of hedge and play a spread of both. Extraction comes in over Spellbombs, and I think we still want to retain access to at least one Spellbomb. Again, they might keep some element of the Past in Flames Grape Shot style stuff around. And again, at worst, this is a 2-mana cantrip that grows our Tarmogoyf. So it's never that bad to bring in one, even if you're not sure they're leaving in the graveyard stuff to any significant degree. So let's add these other 2 to the maybe board pile for now, of stuff we might consider if we have way too much in the main deck that we hate. Now here, what do we like between Pulse, Charm, and Explosives? Well, let's examine. Maelstrom Pulse is pretty nice because it can cleanly kill all of the goblins, or it can just kill a Mana Bear. It can kill a Baral, it can kill a Goblin Electromancer, and I have even seen some Storm players play Thing in the Ice out of the side too. So this is just another piece of removal that can catch stuff like that. And we will be siding out some number of our 1-for-1 spot removal here. So having more copies of outs to resolve the Mana Bears or plan C stuff like Thing in the Ice, definitely a point in favor of Pulse. That also applies to Engineer Explosives. An EE on 2 can take care of a Mana Bear. Realistically, they might not expose 2 Mana Bears, that'd just be kind of a weird progression if they did, but sometimes you could 2 for 1. Again, that kills Thing in the Ice, and again, this kills all of their tokens, so I like that, and Golgari Charm is definitely okay as an out to the tokens, but it cannot kill Baral or Electromancer or Thing in the Ice. I don't care about destroying enchantments unless they show me Pyromancer's Ascension, which is not a very common piece of technology any longer. Now, if they show us Pyromancer's Ascension, then maybe we want to revisit this, and regen is not that relevant. They can value Grape Shot us to kill a thing or two sometimes, but, our stuff is high enough toughness like Tarmogoyf and Tassiger. If they're doing that, it's not great for them anyway, right? So, let's put Charm in the maybe board, and let's say we want access to 2. So we've got a 2-2 split of stuff that attacks the grave or, the deck, I guess, versus stuff that attacks the board. And we've got 2 things that attack the hand as well. So I really like this spread, especially for game 2, when we haven't seen exactly how they sideboard against us. Now, here's another benefit of Surgical Extraction. We can see exactly how they side if we resolve that. And if our opponent just, resubmits quickly, you can assume they're on the similar plan. Maybe we can make a couple quick tweaks as well. So, anyway, those 6 cards are what comes in, so what comes out? Well, like I said, we are going to remove some number of spot removal that is just not good enough, and Assassin's Trophy is the primary culprit here. Ramping them is very, very bad, and it's still just a 1-for-1, which obviously is terrible against a million tokens, and it's only okay against Baral and Electromancer. Even if we forget that it ramps them, it's only okay. Storm players may also side out all of their Mana Bears against a heavy removal deck like ours. We cannot assume they're going to do that. They won't always do so, but that is also a concern. So we're even going to cut the Abrupt Decay, because again, just a 2-mana 1-for-1, not particularly exciting. Trophy is actively bad. Decay is underwhelming enough that we want to cut it. So those are 4 pretty free cuts right there. And Liliana the Last Hope is also pretty poor. So we could probably cut both, right? She's not a realistic win condition, because even if we get her to ult, they can still storm off before we can kill them. They can make a token army that outsizes ours, or they can just Grape Shot us to death. Her -2 is not particularly relevant, and her +1 doesn't kill their Mana Bears. Yeah, it can start picking off tokens, but so you could leave 1, and I think 1 is actively bad. The other one is pretty poor and will probably come out, but let's look at what else. So we could consider cutting a Tracker just because it's a little slow, although post-board the games can become a little grindier. Liliana the Veil's completely amazing. Tassiger is quite fine. Pulse is good. Goyf is amazing. Scavenging Ooze is amazing. This is part of why we don't need to go all in on bringing in Grave Hate, because even if they're still all in on that plan A, we still have 3 main deckable copies of a Grizzly Bear that gets bigger while attacking their graveyard. So that's just fine. Brutality is amazing. Inquisition and Thoughtseize are amazing. Fatal Push is the other one that's not that great. This is definitely a cleaner answer to their Mana Bears or their Thing in the Ices potentially than Abrupt Decay, or certainly than Trophy, but we could trim up to 2. So if I'm looking at this deck and I don't want to bring anything else, I'm probably just going to cut another Liliana. The Tireless Tracker can still help you end the game, on turn 5 like we did last game, just as a 3-2. And if the game gets grindy enough, sure, Tracker is definitely going to do Tracker things, and that's always great for us if the game goes long and we've got Tracker. So this 60, I think, is totally fine. Now, the remaining 3 potential cuts are going to depend upon what you think or know your opponent is up to. If you need just another out to the tokens and or they're bringing in Pyromancer's Ascension, you want the Golgari Charm. If you know they're all in on graveyard stuff still, you probably want another Spellbomb or two. Or, if you want to play around with attacking their mana base, these 3 cards are all, you know, they might be medium, but they're at least viable. So I can see cutting these 3 for, you know, any number of these 3 for some combination of these 6 things, depending on what your opponent's up to, and all that good stuff. Fulminators and Chokes might be better on the play than on the draw. That is also a consideration as well, but that's how we sideboard against Storm, in my opinion. If anyone has other alternatives to offer, as always, please do not hesitate to share them. But otherwise, let's go on to Game 2 and see how our sideboarding treats us. Alright everybody, Game 2 on the draw against Storm, having won Game 1, and our opponent has kept 7. We will also be keeping 7. Our hand is pretty good. Once again, we kind of have 3.5 lands and 3.5 spells, if we consider the man land to have a foot in both camps. And we have a turn 1 discard spell, which is great. We have 1 Fatal Push, which is pretty much the exact number we want to see. This is our out to Mana Bears. We don't want to get flooded with them or anything, but having 1 feels good. Tasigur is, of course, a pretty nice early-ish threat that looks like it will be able to come down early this game. We can fill up our yard more quickly with Thoughtseize, Fetch Land, potentially push if they play a creature. Yeah, looks fine to me. Opponent loves their Spirebluff Canals. That's the only land we've seen from them so far, and they don't have a turn 1 cantrip unless it is an opt that they will play in our end step. So we are going to shock Thoughtseize. That's probably what we would have done anyway, rather than fire up fetch right away. But the fact that we drew Tireless Tracker makes us want to hold this fetch a little bit more than we otherwise would. Okay, yeah, again, they only have Spirebluff Canals in their deck. Alright, fair enough. It's a really good land in the deck. So they do indeed have a couple opts. They have a Monomorphose, as we saw, and they also have Pieces of the Puzzle. Now, this is another piece of sideboard tech, and it is very good against us. Instead of being really linear, focused on comboing off as fast as possible, this lets them still have some card selection and dig pretty deep, while accruing card advantage against a heavily disruptive deck like ours. It's very good. The fact that they have 2 is a little bit annoying, but being on the draw, not having any particularly fast threats, despite the fact that right now they're stranded on 2 lands, yeah, they're gonna get to 3 with these ops. We just have to take one of their grindy value cards. This is the equivalent of taking away Collected Company on turn 1. Even though they're not going to cast it anytime soon, we just know the game is gonna go that long. So we take away the card that represents the most value. They're going to opt in the end step. Spirebluff Canal, Sleight of Hand. And a main phase opt, interesting. And they'll pass. Alright, Treetop Village is not a very exciting draw with another manland already in play. It's a slightly better one for this matchup anyway, but yeah, we really wanted to see some more hand disruption. An Inquisition or Thoughtseize there would have been great, but for now, we cannot do anything except play that and hold up Fatal Push, which is definitely not the worst. Okay, the fact that they lead on a Serum Visions is fine for me. It means I have another turn to draw toward a discard spell to potentially take away that Pieces of the Puzzle before they can cast it. They have cast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cantrips in 3 turns already. That is not bad at all. And they find a 3rd land. They will play it tapped. Tarmogoyf. Alright, well, Tarmogoyf is definitely a card, and I think it's one that I am interested in playing. Here I'm going to run out the fetch land, and I'm going to fetch main phase. Here we are once again playing around the Lightning Bolt, and this time it's more likely to actually be in their deck. So we kind of ruin our fun with Tireless Tracker, but again, cracking a bunch of clues is not realistic in this deck, and we might be playing Tasigur next turn anyway. So they're going to cast their pieces of the puzzle, as we suspected, and they're going to see 5 cards. Abrade, which is presumably a sideboard card that's just kind of a kill spell against us. Ditto Lightning Bolt. Empty the Warrens. So this is the sideboard tech I was talking about that they're likely to switch to, at least partially instead of Grape Shot, Monomorphose, and a Shivan Reef. So this is why Pieces of the Puzzle is great. This is card advantage and card selection, and they also get to fill up the graveyard a bit for when that matters. So they get rid of Empty the Warrens, Shivan Reef, which they cannot take, and the Abrade, so they have Monomorphose, Lightning Bolt, 4 unknowns. Alright. They missed a 4th land drop, though. The fact that they don't have a Mana Bear and no 4th land, that's actually quite good for us, and we draw Collective Brutality. Alright, so here, even though, again, they're a little bit choked on mana, they could draw 4th land and just go off. They could draw Mana Bear and just go off. Like, we have to disrupt their hand now. We are going to pitch a excess land there, and we are going to drain them for 2 because that is relevant. And I accidentally clicked through that a bit too hastily. So they're 6 in hand. We knew about the 2 Monomorphose. We knew about 1 Lightning Bolt. They have another Abrade. They have a Grape Shot, so that card's still in the deck and still definitely a threat. And a Desperate Ritual. So they do have a Ritual, which means their mana woes are not all that great. They still do need a little more help on that front, but they're getting there. So we were interested there in taking either Desperate Ritual or Empty the Warrens, in my opinion. And, you know, Monomorphose is never a bad take, but I don't care about the burn spells here. Don't care about the Bolt and the Abrade. And I don't really care about Grape Shot that much either, because the value Grape Shot is not great against our board. It's usually at its best when it can kill higher value weenies and or a Liliana of the Veil, and that's not the case here. And they're unlikely to storm off and take us from 17 to 0. So the biggest threat is a decent-sized Empty the Warrens, for which we have no real answer at the moment. Of course, we have some on our deck to draw to, but I think that's the take here. I think that's the take we want. So we get to just play out our creature land. Now, if we had pitched that instead of our forest, we could have played Tasigur there as well. Then we're delving away our graveyard a bit. You know, you could go either way. But right now, again, I don't even know if the Mana Bears are still in their deck, right? But if they are, a Mana Bear is a great draw for them, and I would like to just Fatal Push it as soon as it shows up. Alright, looks like they're trying to get a little something going. Monomorphose. Technical difficulties, aka the MTGO replay function, getting confused by Storm yet again, but let's give it a second shot here. So they're going to try to get something going with a Monomorphose here. They're going to Monomorphose again, sure. And they're going to Lightning Bolt us, okay. And they're going to Grape Shot us. Or are they going to hit the Tarmogoyf with any of these? No, they will not. So this is a value Grape Shot. Like I said, with their progression, they were fairly unlikely to take us down, you know, in one shot, right? They really needed a Mana Bear, and then probably for it to survive, which it wouldn't, and then to be able to untap with it. That was simply not the case there. Now, because I had to restart this match because the replay function, you know, failed us the first time, let's try to see where they are with 5 cards in hand, huh? So they don't have this stuff. They spent the Bolt, they spent Monomorphoses, and they spent the Grape Shot. So as far as we know, they have a Braid, Ritual, and 3 unknown. I believe that is correct. My apologies for the technical issues here, but as anyone who has used this replay function extensively knows, it is not without flaws and not without bugs. Let's just put it as nicely as possible. So we will Inquisition them, and look, see, I didn't even need to do that. Was I right? Yeah, they still have the Abrade and the Ritual. Alright. They found another 2 lightning bolts, so they've just got all the lightning bolts in against us. And they have a Past in Flames, so we see the Grape Shot, we see the PIF. They still have a significant number of these graveyard mechanics around, and we have also seen now 2 copies of Empty the Warren, so they just kind of seem to be hedging, with a little bit of everything and roughly a 50-50 split. So here, they only have 3 lands still after 5 turns, and they do not have a Mana Bear. Therefore, I think Ritual is the clear take here. Again, I don't care about the burn spells. They're not doing anything too great here. Past in Flames, they need a lot more mana to make this a danger to us. So we're going to crack in for 3 of the Tarmogoyf. And now it's Tasigur time. So we're going to delve away. Sometimes it's worth reconsidering here. So I thought about taking away the Brutality, but I actually really like Brutality here. Because this is not a Tireless Tracker matchup, so the fact that Brutality is a little clunkier in terms of the mana does not particularly worry me. Like, if we're spending a turn buying anything back with Tasigur, then untapping, it might as well be the thing that can flex into a kill spell for Electromancer or drain you for 2. That's definitely good. Shouldn't really matter. I don't think we'll be delving much with Tasigur, but hey, might as well delve efficiently even when you don't think it will matter, because you never, ever know. Now, our opponent finds an Opt off the top, okay? Still no land, though. They're going to pass. Liliana the Veil is a card that's the earlier the better in a matchup like this, but right now with them choked on mana, that's actually pretty good. With them being on the ropes and at a relatively low life total, it was tempting to fire up a manland here, but they have those bolts and abrades in hand. And they just take it. I really thought we would be eating a double bolt. Maybe our Tasigur would eat a double bolt there, but they don't want it. So, alright, fair enough. Definitely just going to throw down this Liliana. We'll tick her up. At this point, having seen almost half of their deck, I'm pretty convinced that they don't have a Mana Bear left. I don't think they have a Mana Bear left in the deck, and if they do, we can, of course, Edict it away next turn, and it's probably a little too late for a Mana Bear anyway. So, just in case they have, a Roast or something crazy in this deck, and they're able to, get back into the game by just killing our things somehow, I kept the Tireless Tracker, but either way, I think we're pretty much got this one locked up here. They do finally find a 4th land. They're going to shock it in, and now they're in Treetop Village range, or Tarmogoyf range, so they play a Pyretic Ritual, sure. All these burn spells in hand are not that great, and yeah, they just have to go to the Past in Flames now if they're going to go to it at all. And here, without a bear, without any cost reducer, all they can do is flash back a lightning bolt, and they've got a bunch of other bolts in hand, and then they're just dead. So, a little bit of an anticlimactic ending. I think they just wanted to, show us that if they weren't quite so choked on mana, they had a lot of things to do, which is very true. We didn't find any graveyard hate, and, they still had a reasonable amount of very powerful stuff utilizing the graveyard left in the deck. But hey, this just shows once again the power of being proactive. Now this game went on a couple turns longer than game 1 did, and we had to, in the end disrupt a little bit more heavily, but the fundamental principle was the same. We didn't do anything that spectacular. It was not a game where Liliana just broke their backs and just ran them completely out of resources, then ulted to, take away half of their lands. Nothing like that. We just kind of traded 1 for 1 with a few hand disruption spells and then turned some big things sideways. And, they were able to assemble a few, a decent grape shot, and, but they ended up getting stuck with a lot of sideboard what are essentially removal spells in hand. And, I just don't think they line up that well against us. In fact, it's not a matter of think, they just actually don't. Our Tarmogoyf will almost never be smaller than a 3/4. Our Tazagar is, of course, always a 4 or 5. These red removal spells are just not all that against our big stuff. And, maybe they were expecting Dark Confidant. And we did not have that to expose to their 1-for-1 here. So these ended up being really clunky, really not that useful. Now, that said, they were actually not that far away from just bolting us to death after that lethal grape shot. Or after that value grape shot, the double bolt could have been lethal. But again, this is where our relatively painless mana base helps us shine. So, whereas a card like Lightning Bolt is pretty great for Storm to have access to post-side, because it's a flex card, it's a 1 mana instant speed, it adds to your Storm count, it can be a kill spell. If you are a little shy with your grape shots, it can help finish them off. But against us, we play it nice and safe and conservative with our life total, and this is not as powerful a form of reach as it would be against a more painful mana base. And of course, it is not a great answer to the majority of our threats either. So we didn't do anything all that crazy. We just sideboarded, kind of hedging against either game plan they could have, and they were on, they were doing essentially what we expect them to do, which is retain a little bit of the main deck stuff like Grape Shot and Past in Flames, and then bring in some sideboard stuff like Empty the Warrens and Pieces of the Puzzle that does not depend on the graveyard to be good. And granted, we didn't even really need to see any sideboard cards. We just kind of won with our main deck disruption. Now, I think this matchup is pretty solid for us, but there was a bit of a learning curve for me. So when I was starting out on BGX, I was playing a lot of Abzan, and this was like half a year ago, maybe a little bit more now. And at this time, it seemed like not that many Storm players were moving into the Empty the Warren stuff. Or maybe it's just variance in people. I was not facing as good of pilots. But even though Abzan, the Path to Exile is bad for the same reason Assassin's Trophy is bad here, Lingering Souls doesn't really do anything, Stony Silence doesn't do anything, so the white for Abzan isn't accomplishing anything. So I was basically just playing a worse Golgari deck against them, and I was smoking them. Like, left, right, and center, I was like, hell, this matchup is a cakewalk. When I switched over to Golgari, I actually had a dip in my win rate, and it's because, for a while, I was not sideboarding correctly. I was going too heavy on Grave Hate, and I was not hedging enough against the Empty the Warrens and Pieces of the Puzzle pieces of sideboard tech. So, again, that could just be variance. It could be that Storm players have always done that, and I was just running into more who didn't when I was on Abzan for whatever reason. But it seems like this is pretty firmly something they should be doing against us, and we don't want to play around our opponent being bad or uninformed, right? We want to play around what they should do and can we answer it. So I like having a little Grave Hate, and I like having a significant number of ways to sweep out their Goblin tokens, but sometimes you don't need either. Sometimes just a good old-fashioned Hand Disruption, Tarmogoyf, Liliana of the Veil, these cards can definitely get us there. So Storm games can get crazy. Storm games can get really grindy. They can get really convoluted. They can have insane turns on the opposite side of the table. And sadly enough, I've had plenty of them with some really intense matchups that the replay function just will not support. Just will not run those back in any kind of a realistic replica of what actually happened. So this was one of the more tame Storm matchups relative to that, but I still think it was a useful one. I still think it was a good display of what our deck can do, and I still think it was a useful platform from which to discuss sideboard plans, and again, with those, I would love to hear your thoughts. So anyway, that's about the long and short of it, and we took down Storm 2-0, doing some pretty basic BGX stuff, but sometimes that is all it takes. So, as always, everybody, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you for the next one. Have a great night.